Well, here we are on a Saturday. I suppose that since tomorrow is Sunday, we might tell a story that relates to a Sunday. Now, this is the absolute truth, embellished only by bad memory and countless retelling with perhaps some falsification. But nonetheless, one Sunday morning, I was mowing the lawn. That's why we still had real lawn out front. And I was on call, and I got a call from the emergency room at St. Joseph's Hospital. And they said, "Get down here quick. You're needed to see the King of Nigeria." So I put on some decent clothes and went down as quickly as I could. That would be about a 15-minute journey. And got out of my car, was approached by a man who informed me he was from the State Department, who stopped me and told me that I was to address the patient as His Highness. So I went on into the emergency room, and as it turned out, it didn't make a lot of difference because the king was unconscious. So I nonetheless dutifully approached him as Your Highness and did my examination, and we proceeded to evaluate the situation and admit him to the hospital for care. As it turns out, I'm not sure what sort of tribal chieftain he was, but or where he stood in the hierarchy in Nigeria, but the man had an absolutely commanding presence. He was very, very black, very, very big, and was about 6'5", and had a manner of caring for himself that transmitted his authority and his ease in that position of authority. One of the interesting things during that hospitalization was that if the king, His Highness, wanted something, he didn't tell the nurse, he didn't tell me, he called the State Department, whose foreign desk called me and gave the instructions. As it turns out, there was a very, very pretty black nurse at St. Joe's, Miss Watson, who was a charming, lovely RN, and he wanted her as his private duty nurse. It goes without saying that that happened, and it goes without saying that she was pleased. As it turns out, we studied this man. He had had a seizure, lost consciousness. When I'd seen him, he was in the postictal period, and when he woke up, he was fully with the program. Well, it was at that time, about that time, that Grover Kempf had died, and he had been kind enough to give to us a box of treasures, including a number of fabrics that came from Africa and had been brought to him by a co-worker who had been a dignitary there. And when he would come home, he would bring back things to the museum, and the things that the museum didn't want, he'd give or perhaps sell, I don't know, to Grover. That's where the elephant came from in our entryway, was Grover, and through that same connection. So, foolish as I was, I took this box of various fabrics down, woven fabrics, and showed them to His Highness. And one of them, which was a plain, sort of a grayish tan, large thing, had a peculiar worn spot in it. In this whole big fabric, there was one spot where the threads, it was a little threadbare. And I'll never forget him taking that, holding it in his hand, rubbing the fabric between his fingers, and saying, SOPA. SOPA. And I said, I'm sorry, Your Highness, I don't understand. What do you mean, SOPA? And he looked at me and he said, as in the superlative degree. His Highness had been Oxford trained, and he had an English accent, and superlative had been reduced to SOPA. That's still a term we use at our house when something's really extra special and wonderful. It's SOPA. He said it was goat hair, and he said you never saw anything woven to this degree of fineness in this day and age. We still have that. I didn't explain to you, though, what that worn spot was. He stood up in all his height, took this, threw it over his shoulder, and the worn spot was where it reached the shoulder tip, which would have been the most weight-bearing spot on the piece of fabric. At any rate, it was quite an experience. We found out what was causing his seizures. He had a vascular malformation in his brain. And later I got a call many years later from a physician, a neurologist in Africa, who was seeing him and wondered what we had found when we had done the arteriogram. And it was vivid in my mind as to where he had been here, what we had seen, and as my memory serves, he was the Oba Obakan or something like that. He'd come to visit someone who had visited Africa, Mr. Goodman, who was at that time a man of African American descent, who was big in city government. So it was a memorable Sunday, an event that has never left, and one of the wonderful prized encounters I've had in the many years of doing neurology.